Late as usual. It's my style. Well, hello there. Diffs today. I'm gonna build diffs at the same time. I'm gonna talk about diff setup and build diffs. Can you hear? Do we have sound issues again? Can you hear me? Come on. Can you hear me? Sound is good, okay. Let's wait for some people. I already did one video where I explained how to build the diffs, so I'm not gonna do that today. I'm just building them. Because just sitting here talking is weird enough. Anthony, Mr. Kyosho USA is here. Getting some speed secrets. He is pretty fast already, so I don't know if he should be watching. Andy Kramer loves to hear my voice. That's good, Andy. I miss you too. LRP is still in business? I think so, right? That's good. Anthony wants to learn about diff setup so he can beat me next year when I go over there. Well, this year actually. November. $67 people. I think that's about it for today. I didn't advertise. Cheers, Lars. Prost. What's up, Joe? Okay, so I figure I'll talk about all three diffs first, and then just diffs in general, and you can ask questions and I'll try to reply. If I know the answer, I'll respond. Don't you like Padova? That's got nothing to do with diffs, but I'm not a huge fan. I've never raced there. Never raced there. We can make 100. It was just 91 people. 91. We can make 100, then I'll start. Before we make 100, I made the mistake of going to ride my dirt bike on a sand track. And if you've ever ridden a dirt bike on sand, you know that it's really difficult. And I fell probably 5 times at least, and one of those times on a straight. So like it was a 90-degree corner, and I just drifted too far out, and then I hit the side of the track, and my front wheel just went like that, and basically stopped in the sand, and I continued. So I went over the bars and almost hit my balls on the bars. I didn't this time. I just got a nice bruise on my stomach and hurt my wrist. So yeah, that's why I don't like riding on sand, because I suck. So much for that. Yeah, I know, Anthony. You just have to kind of keep the throttle pinned and go for it. When things get sketchy, you just keep it pinned. But you see, with me, what happens is I just end up falling at a much higher speed. So, oh well. Well, it's over 100 people now. So we can start talking about diffs. So, where to begin? Front diff. I'm building a front diff. Explain what changing that internal gearing in the diffs does. Well, I never do that. I don't have the gears to do that. But apparently some other companies do, and they have like high grip diffs and low grip diffs or something, I don't know. I suspect that whatever those high grip diffs are, those are just the ones to use always. That's what I think. I mean, the internal gears in the diff just change how it's like gearing, like changing your spur gear and pinion. It's how the diff works. When it starts diffing out, how fast the other wheel turns compared to the other. But I've never tried that, so I wouldn't know. I use the industry standard. So anyway, front diff. I think of the three diffs, the front diff is the least critical. What I mean by that is, if you have a good car and you put the wrong front diff oil in, your car's still going to be good. If you have a car that's hard to drive, you're not going to solve it by changing the front diff oil. That's my feeling. So in that respect, the front diff is the least critical and least important of the three diffs. So let me just get that diff oil. Gather my thoughts here. So for me, I tend to keep the front diff oil very similar. When I change diffs, I mostly change the center and the rear. The front diff mainly affects steering, how the steering feels. So with a thinner front diff, you'll have more off-power steering. So when you go into a corner, you'll have slightly more steering with a thinner diff. So if you're on a slippery track, let's say you're on a loose track and your car pushes, especially in slow corners. Moi Keijo, Mäkinen. Especially in slow corners like hairpins. So you go into the hairpin and the car just pushes straight. Well, that's a situation where you could try a thinner front diff oil, and then instead of you turning and the car just pushing, you turn and the car will turn in. But as I said, the front diff is the least critical, so I would first do other setup changes to try and get the car to turn instead of changing the diff. Because one negative thing with having a thin front diff is you lose drive. So when you then have turned into the corner and you want to exit the corner, so you want to get on the gas and you want to go, first of all, you can't get on the gas as early necessarily because you don't have as much on-power steering with a thin diff. So going in the corner, the car turns in well. Then you get on the gas to get out to the corner and it doesn't turn as well anymore. And even just in a straight line, the car won't accelerate as well. So that's why if I'm on a loose track and I want more steering, I won't go to a thinner diff. I'll do something else. I'll change my front sway bar. I'll go to a thinner front sway bar, for example. Or what else could I do? I lost a gear now. Maybe I would change my kick up. Maybe I just need the car to be more responsive. So I'd go less kick up. I rarely change caster also, but that's another thing. Maybe one of you would like that. So if you go less caster, you can also get the car to turn in more. So I don't really like going to a thinner front diff oil to get more off-power steering, but that's what it does. And as I said, then exiting the corner, you'll have less on-power steering with a thin diff, and that's not a good thing. And you also have less drive, so that's also not a good thing. So then you can already guess what happens with a thicker front diff. So with a thicker front diff, you have less off-power steering. So when you go into the corner, your car is going to push more. Well, on a loose track, that's bad. But on a high grip track, that's actually a good thing. On a high grip track, many times, your car might feel nervous. So it's hard to drive. It's too aggressive initially when you turn the steering wheel. Maybe it's hard to enter corners, especially at high speed, because it grabs, it's so aggressive. Well, then a thicker front diff will numb it down a bit, make it easier to enter corners. But again, if your car is very nervous and the only thing you change is the front diff, I don't think it's going to completely solve that. Yes, it helps, but it's not a solution really. And the thick diff, not only does it make it easier to drive on the high grip, because it numbs it down going into the corner, then when you want to get out of the corner, it has more on-power steering. So you can get on the throttle earlier and your car turns more. And then even just going straight, your car will accelerate more with a thicker front diff. Now I've almost finished building the front diff, and I feel like I covered the front diff aspect. What else do I need to say? I actually have Lunsford titanium screws for this one. This is not for THEQuagraine, this is for myself. I'm doing this right. What else? On my car, I tend to use 10,000 to 15,000 in the front diff. That's really the range. And almost always just 12,500, because it's like halfway there. Just works. Have enough steering, all conditions. Pimp wagon. Anyway, that's the front diff. Any questions? Any questions? Does the thicker front diff put more wear on the front tires? I don't think so. I mean, if you think about it, it might actually put less wear or more even wear on the tires. Because if you have a thin front diff, when you exit the corner, the inside tire is going to balloon up as the front diff is diffing out, and that's when the tire wears out. So. But in any case, not a big difference really. So thicker for on power and thinner for off power. That's right. That's the basic rule. But as I said, I would rather achieve those things with other setup changes. I would set the diff up to be, if I'm unsure, I would rather have a diff that's a bit too thick. Let's put it that way. I would set the diff a bit thick and then get the steering in other ways. And Gary just wants to know the diff oils for 90% of the time, and then e-buggy. That's not going to happen, because I need to build these 3 diffs, and I've done 1 now. So this is like, because you're there watching, I have to do this. Like, I can't just sit here, touch myself and watch YouTube. You know, I have to work. 1 diff done. Have I run small diffs, smart diffs? Sorry, I can't read. Also, do you use aluminium crosspins? No, I have steel crosspins, and I haven't run a smart diff. What's a smart diff? Who makes a smart diff? Is that the Losi one? This is like the BBF diff. How about adding bump steer, gain, corner steering? Well, I mean, it's minimal. Like, you can play around with bump steer, but it's really minimal what it does. Okay, let's move on. Front diff covered. Center diff time. So unlike the front diff, the center diff can really mess you up. If you go too thin, you're just going to be slow. You're going to feel good, and you're going to be slow. If you go too thick, the car's going to be hard to drive. So the center diff, you really need to nail the setup to get the best performance. Front diff, as I said, you can kind of go too thin or too thick, and it's not a huge deal. Like, the car's still going to be good if you have a good car. But if you have a good car and you go too thin on the center diff, you'll have a good car that's slow. If you go too thick on the center diff, you'll have a good car that's hard to drive when you get on the gas. So, I don't know, is that good anymore? I don't know. So the center diff's a bit trickier because the center diff affects steering, drive, and one could say traction, because it affects the distribution of the drive front to rear. So this is going to be a bit trickier to explain. A lot of people joining still, that's good. What's up? Sorry I'm missing your messages. I'm trying to make sense. And with me that takes a lot of concentration. It's like chewing gum and walking at the same time. It's complicated. So, building this diff and trying to explain how it works. I can't read at the same time. Mau Graphics even joining. Nice. Okay, so a thin center diff. I feel like if the thinner you go on the center diff, basically the easier the car is to drive. So you don't have to be precise with the throttle, you can kind of do whatever, and it's never going to get loose. You're never going to lose the rear end. So it feels easy. So you might think, okay, well that's good, I'll just run a really thin center diff. Well, there's a few problems with that. One is that on high grip, or medium to high grip, let's say, a thin center diff can actually make the car hard to drive. I know that kind of doesn't make any sense, but it, trust me, it just works that way. Like on a loose track, a thin center diff always just easy. Then on a high grip track, especially if it's bumpy too, it can actually make it harder to drive. And the reason is just the inconsistency, how the front suddenly grabs when you accelerate. Like if you imagine a locked, like there's no center diff, all four tires will have drive when you accelerate. Well, when you have a center diff, the drive will always go to the end with the least amount of traction. So when you first accelerate, all four wheels turn and have drive. The car squats, the front wheels get light, and the drive goes to the front because the front wheels have less grip, less traction. They can turn easier, so that's where the power goes. Likewise, if you go into a corner and your nose dives and then you get on the gas, with a very thin center diff, it will transfer the drive to the rear tires. Like if you're in that position, the car is diving and turning and then you get on the gas, actually the rear tires will start to drive easier with a thinner diff. So that's why on a high grip track, when the car is doing a lot, it will feel inconsistent. So a thin diff could actually be harder to drive on a high grip track. But as I said, low grip track, thinner diff is always easier. So that's one problem with a thin diff. It can be inconsistent if the traction goes up. Another problem with a thin center diff is it feels good, but it's slow because you don't have drive. Instead of the car acting more of like a four-wheel drive car, so when you get on the throttle, it just goes. It will like it's almost like the front wheels just do a burnout. So that the car accelerates, the front wheels lift up a bit, and most of the power is going there, and they're just spinning, skidding. If you had a thicker front diff, the same thing would happen, but there's more drive going to the rear wheels because of the thicker diff, which gives more drive. Because when you accelerate, the rear tires can have more traction, they have more weight on it, right? So with a thicker diff, the car is more forward drive and more drive on the rear tires, so you have more drive. That means you can be faster with a thicker diff, because the car accelerates faster. A third thing which is bad with a thin center diff is you have less steering, less off power steering. Actually, less on power steering too. But say on a slippery track, you go into a hairpin, the car pushes. It actually pushes more with a very thin center diff. On power, actually, yeah, I mean, on power, same thing. It depends a bit more on the car setup, I guess, but similar sort of thing. I think off power definitely you have less. On power is a bit dependent on the car and the track and the setup. Because yes, the front wheels are the ones that are going to be driving more. So yes, you could say that you have on power steering. But then again, the rear is the one that would make the car turn on power. So yeah, I guess the jury's out on that on power thing. So anyway, it's not always said that the car is easier to drive with a thinner center diff. Loose track, it's easier to drive. High grip track, it could get hard to drive with a diff that's too thin. A thin diff also is slower than a thicker diff. So when you go thicker on the center diff, you'll have more drive, as I said, more acceleration. In long mains, the car will feel more consistent. So say for a 45-minute or 1-hour main, it makes sense to have thick diffs, so they stay more consistent. What else about a thick diff? Off power, you'll have more steering. Then the negative aspect of a center diff that's too thick is that at some point when you get on the throttle, the car will be hard to drive. And when I say hard to drive, I mean you accelerate out of the corner and the rear will feel loose, or you'll hit a bump and the rear will get loose, or you just drive through some bumps on power and the car will feel loose, like the rear doesn't have grip. And if that happens when you're on power, when you're accelerating, that's a sign that the center diff is too thick for the conditions. I can't believe my battery is already dying. I need a new phone, I think. So, let me just hook this up here first. This is like every time I do this, I need to charge my phone. Every freaking time. Oh, how am I gonna do this now? What did I put back there last time? Oh, come on. This is hopeless. Maybe an LRP receiver pack. There we go. Yep, it's an iPhone. Stay. What was I saying? Something about the center diff. Yeah, so a sign that the diff oil is too thick is that you tend to spin out, the rear loses traction when you get on the gas. Like a good rule would be, keep going thicker on the center diff until you start losing the rear end when you run the gas or when you accelerate. That's a good rule. I think the thicker you can run the center diff, the faster you can be. Really. That's what I think. Hot take. So as an example, I like to run 20,000 in the center diff. I know it's crazy, but the black edition likes thick diff oil. You can ask Greg Nagani about that. So let's say 20,000 is pretty much my standard diff setup now. Revelation, I still run 20,000, but at Revelation at night for the main, when it gets really bumpy, it's loose at night, it's bumpy, then I would go down. I'd go down to like 10,000 or 15,000 just to make it easier to drive. Same for Thunder Rally. If I'm at Thunder Rally and I'm practicing and it's dry, it's pretty high grip, so I can run 20,000. Then if it's a club race and they water the track and it gets rough, then 20,000 is too much. So I would have to go down. I go down 10 to 15,000. If it's really loose and really bumpy and it still feels hard to drive, then I go less, like 8,000, 6,000, 8,000. But normally I don't like going below 10 because I feel like I lose drive. And the car feels slow and I just punch it too much because I'm trying to make up for the lost drive. I know on many other cars you tend to run very thin oils like 5,000, 6,000, 8,000, 7,000. And I mean, that's fine, but I think many times you could actually get away with running thicker oil if you just try. Yeah. Anything else on the center diff? Almost finished this. Any questions? I can't think of anything to say. So, center diff, in conclusion, center diff more critical than the front diff. It affects steering, it affects drive, it affects traction. The thicker you can go, the faster the car will be. A thin diff is easier to drive on a slippery track, always. On a high grip track, a thin diff can actually be harder to drive because it makes the car inconsistent. The negative sides of a thicker diff is it makes the car loose. You lose your rear end when you accelerate, when you go through bumps. Typically, a thinner center diff is better in bumps. If the bumps are very big, sometimes a thicker diff is better because it just skips over them instead of going into them. Someone asked about that center diff weight. I find that the center diff weight makes the car more stable and makes it carry more corner speed easier. So the difference between being on power and off power is smaller. And so you go in a corner, you let off the throttle and the car just kind of rolls easier, rolls better. So you maintain the corner speed. Then you get on the gas, it's smoother. I guess because of a heavier drivetrain. So yeah, so I really like the center diff weight, and we're making more, so soon we'll have them again. And it's also good because the weight is very central. And it's also turning in the opposite direction to the engine. So I think that's all good. I think it's 23 grams. So it's not a whole lot, but it's all on the diff. E-buggy, same setup. Normally, yes. I mean, I never really set my e-car up. I'll just run like old front and rear gearbox off the nitro. So it's the same setup, and center diff too. E-buggy, normally maybe you can even get away with running thicker center diff than normal. So, yeah. I haven't tested if the center diff weight affects runtime. If it does affect runtime, I would assume it's very little. Normally your e-buggy is from rebuild at Neo. Yes, like Neo 2 years ago. I'm gonna have a new new e-buggy for next year. I'm gonna race it at the Dirt Nitro Challenge, I guess. Maybe first time. It's gonna be new. So, yeah. Huge respect for e-buggy. Actually, Liam built Jay Smoker a new e-buggy, so even Jay is gonna have a new one. Okay, center diff done. I feel like we covered that. No more questions are coming in. Nothing. That's it. I think I didn't order enough screws. Titanium screws. Will thicker center diff help rotate the rear when it pushes off power? Yes, I said that. Thicker center diff helps with off power steering on loose tracks. So you're pushing, hairpin, car doesn't turn, thicker center diff actually helps a bit there. Active diff, I haven't tried it, but I think the lossy one is very similar to BBF. Back in the day we used to use them, they were very good. Nowadays, all those kind of special diffs except the Kyosho LSD. Was it LSD? I feel like that's just a drug. Well, anyway, except that thing, they're kind of falling out of fashion. Like no one's running those really anymore, or very much anymore. Anyway, those like Torsen diffs and all of those things. Basically, the idea with those is to have a like thin diff feel, so you have a lot of steering, but then when you get on the throttle you have a lot of, like it's more like a thicker diff. So you have a lot of steering off power and a lot of drive on power. That's the idea behind them. So off power, a lot of steering. Also another thing, like thin diffs tend to go better in bumps off power. Like more consistent traction off power with thin diffs. So that's good for those like special diffs. But then with thin diffs, when you get on power, that's when it gets sketchy. That's when those diffs more or less lock up. They have more friction in them. So then they work like a thicker oiled diff on power. That's the idea behind those. Front diff, we already covered, dude. You're gonna have, after this video is uploaded, you have to go back and watch from the beginning. We covered that. So now we're on to the rear diff. Hey Mr. JQ, maybe I should have asked you to build my car in your videos. Yeah, maybe you should have. Sorry. Too late now. Okay, rear diff. This is gonna be the hardest one to explain. Rear diff, I feel, is the one that people forget about. It's a speed secret. Let's put it that way. There's a certain sweet spot to a rear diff, and going either side of that is going to make the car harder to drive. Just like the center diff, the rear diff is more critical than the front diff. So a rear diff can make a good car bad, and center diff can make a good car bad, but a front diff can't make a good car bad. That's what I feel. And likewise, if your car is really bad, you can't make it good by changing the front diff. But if your car is bad because the center diff or the rear diff is way wrong, then you could actually make the car good by just changing the diff. So that's something to keep in mind. The center and rear diffs really affect the handling of the car a lot. Okay, I'm thinking how I'm gonna explain this. So, as I said, there's a sweet spot to where the right diff oil works basically in all conditions and the car is easy to drive. So I'll explain it this way. With a thin rear diff, when you enter a corner, you'll have more steering because the rear will swing around more. So if you enter too fast, too aggressively, you might spin out. So you might actually lose traction too quickly and the rear might spin around. Then when you exit the corner, you get on the throttle. A thin diff is normally easier to drive. But if it's too thin for the conditions, then it can actually be harder to drive because when you get on the throttle, the rear is diffing out. Like, oh, instead of having smooth drive on both tires, the car leans a bit and it diffs out and it loses traction and it gets hard to drive. So you need to go a bit thicker on the diff oil. So if you have just grease in the rear, super light. Going into the corner, a lot of steering. I said in the video, a thinner rear diff is easier to drive. So you go extreme, you go grease in the rear. Get on the gas, it's too thin. There's no resistance there. So then it's going to be inconsistent again because the rear will start diffing out instead of maintaining smooth left to right drive. So that's what I mean by a sweet spot. So you don't go as thin as you can go, you go maybe 3000 rear diff oil. So what 3000 does is it's thicker than grease, but it's still very thin. So you go into a corner off power, there's going to be a bit of resistance to that spinning out that I explained about. So it's not going to spin out as easily. You'll still have good steering off power into the corner. Then when you get on the power, the rear diff is going to have a bit more resistance. So it's not going to diff out and be inconsistent and lose traction for you. But it's 3000, it's still pretty thin. What happens then when you go to a thicker oil, like 5000, 7000, 10,000, or even more than that? The thicker you go, the less steering you'll have into a corner. So that's actually good, because you go into the corner and it makes the car easier to drive. It pushes a bit more. But then when you get on throttle, the rear is going to have more drive, way more drive. So if you just accelerate straight on high grip, that's fine. It's actually going to accelerate a lot faster. But as you typically accelerate while turning, so you're going around a corner, then you start to accelerate, so the car isn't straight yet. Then it straightens out and then it goes. The thicker your rear diff, the harder it is to do that. So when you get on the throttle, if you just get on the throttle hard while turning, the rear will want to push out. And then it will be loose, and then eventually you'll go straight. So with a thicker diff oil in the rear, you have to be smooth on the throttle, finish the corner, and then go. And basically on big tracks, like flowing, wide open tracks, a thicker rear diff oil is faster, because it's easier to kind of flow around the track, drift the car a bit, and you have more drive. And you don't need that steering in tight hairpins. On a small track, like let's say Neo Buggy or something, you need a lot of steering. A thick rear diff would be hard to drive, or could be hard to drive, because you won't have the steering in the hairpins, and then when you're on throttle and getting on the throttle, the rear wants to drift out. So if I explain that well enough, you'll understand that if you go too thin, it can make the car hard to drive. And if you go too thick, it can also make the car hard to drive. So there's this area, like this window, where the diff oil is good and suitable for the conditions and for your driving. And normally everyone tends to run something like 3,000 to 5,000 in the rear. For me, actually, this year, because of how the setup has evolved and because of how stable the Black Edition is, I've actually started going a lot thicker on the rear diff, and it's been really good. So I've been running 12,000 in the rear, 15,000 in the rear. When I tried 20,000, it was like a bit too much, I felt. So I've often run now 12,000 in the front, 20,000 in the center, and 12,000 in the rear. And what that does is it makes the car very consistent for me. So the way it turns on and off power, how it accelerates, how it navigates the track is very neutral. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. And the thicker rear diff just made it a lot faster. So it gave the car more corner speed. I could drive more on power, and I had better lap times. And I just kept on going thicker and thicker until I felt like either I was losing steering in hairpins or off power, or the car would be hard to control on power. And as I said, I ended up running like 12,000 in the rear, and it felt good. But again, this depends a lot on the track you're running. So if you're at Thunder Rally and it's club race and they water the track and it gets bumpy, then probably 12,000 in the rear is going to be too thick. But a bit like the center diff, for me at least, the thicker I can run and get away with, the faster the car will be. So yeah, that's what I think. Did you understand that? Did it make sense? These diffs I'm building now, I'm going to a race in Indonesia, never been there before. Apparently it's kind of slick. The track looks pretty big actually in the pictures. I'm going with, what did I put? 12,000 in the front, 20,000 in the center, 10,000 in the rear. That's how I'm going to start. and then I'll adjust from there. So, conclusion, rear diff. There's a sweet spot. If you go too thin, car will be hard to drive. If you go too thick, car will be hard to drive. If it's too thin, the car will be, it will oversteer off power. Go into a corner, spin out. No good. Exit the corner on throttle. It's hard to just go straight. The car will want to wander. It doesn't want to go straight. It's weird. Let's just say that. And it's because the rear wants to diff out. If you go too thick, easy to enter the corner because the car pushes, but as soon as you get on the throttle, it can even feel like the car is broken. Like the rear is just drifting. You get on the power, the rear starts drifting. If you're in bumps, you might spin out. That's what happens when the rear diff is too thick. And when the rear diff is just right, it will be neutral going into the corner. You get on the throttle, it just finishes the corner and goes straight. Seems like rear diffs are usually 2 less than front diff. Well, for me, yes, maybe, but I mean, most setups I see is like 773 or 573 or 10-10-5 or something like. It's not always like that. I don't know. But normally, you could say most setups that you see, front and center diffs are the same, or center diff is thicker, and rear diff is the thinnest of them all. That's like most of the setups you see. So any questions about the rear diff? And then just a few comments about diffs in general after that. And then we'll be done, because I've almost finished building. What's wrong? I missed a comment. Who said I'm wrong? Wrong. A thicker rear diff will have less off-power steering and the car will push a bit more on entry. Isn't that what I said? It can make the car easier to drive off-power for this reason. But I said that. What are you talking about, Gary? The car will have more drive and acceleration, but it can make the rear loose due to this. And you have to be more careful with the... Isn't that exactly what I said? What is the benefit of running a thick center like 573 in a Kyosho instead of 553? I think the benefit is that you have more drive. So you will have, dare I say, invisible speed. We have to speak about invisible speed at some point. But you are doing the same thing and the car is accelerating faster. It's still, that's why I said you should go thicker on the diffs until you notice something negative. Because when you are thicker on the diffs, you can go faster. So that's what I feel. Like 553 might feel more comfortable. Because the thin diff, it's more forgiving. But 573, if you can get away with it, you'll be faster. That's what I think. At least you can be faster. Do you over-underdrive gears for your front or rear diff? No, I don't. Actually, I was wanting to make an overdrive which is just one tooth difference, so it's a very slight difference. The problem with the overdrive is the difference is too big, and I feel like it cooks the center diff. Like in a main, your center diff will just overheat, and your car will be inconsistent towards the end. So I've just run normal gearing. Like think the overdrive kind of, it feels like your brakes are on when you let off the throttle. And then on power, it's actually good. Like it, on power, the front dominates more, and it's almost like the rear end is just following the front. So it's definitely a different feeling. But standard gearing is the most neutral and safe bet. Do you need to adjust throttle control now with overall thicker diffs? More feather-like throttle, more controlled input than just punched out? Not really. Like, going from very thin diffs to, say, 773, then going from 773 to what I run is no different. That's the point. Like, I just started going thicker and thicker and thicker until I started noticing negative side effects. And I could just get away with running thicker oil. Like, I would drive and my car felt fine. Like, it's good. And then just go thicker on the diff oils, my car felt fine. Go thicker again, fine. And I was just going faster. So I was going faster and the car still felt the same. I was still driving the same. And then at the end it was just, if anything, it was just easier to drive. And because it was easier to drive, I could drive more aggressively, even though the diff oils were thicker. What increments do you go up at? It depends on how big of a difference I want, but normally you can easily change from 5 to 10 or 10 to 15 in the front. Center, same thing. Like, you can go from 8 to 12 or 10 to 15 or 15 to 20, and it's not a big deal. The rear is a bit different. The rear, let's say you have 3, you can go to 5, and that's already a big difference. Then 5, you go to 7. So front and center, like a 5,000 change, not a huge deal. You can do it and be safe. Rear, the same thing. If you want to do a change and be safe, do a change of 2. That's what I think. Where the hell is the Proto diff? We have seen it. Where did you hide it? I never made it because it doesn't work. I mean, it works, but it's different. It's like, it's very aggressive. It's like, just like the low CXX4 10 scale 4-wheel diff. If I mix 5 and 7, does that make 6 or 12? If I mix 5 and 7, does that make 6 or 12? It makes neither, Cody. You should know that. But good question, man. Good question. You can probably Google that. Google that and tell me. I don't know exactly what it makes. So for a long main, like 30 to 45 minutes, going up from 5.53 to 7.75 would be more consistent. Yes, except if you're running in California at night and it's cold and bumpy and slippery. Like if you're running a Nitro Challenge, then I would still say yes. It's higher grip, high speed. But on a California watered track where it gets cold at night and it's loose, then it's probably just going to be harder to drive. But yeah, in general, if you go a bit thicker on the diffs, it's going to be better for the long mains. If I was racing there, I would either keep the diffs the same or maybe just go up on the center diff. That's what I'd do. When it's hot, I would definitely go up. Like if I wasn't already running thick diffs, like if I wasn't already running like 15, 27 or something, then if I was running 5.53 for example, and going into a main, and it was warm, then I would go up on the diff oils, yes. Like I would go 7.74 or 10.10.5 or something. Definitely. Torres, Team Mexico. You should try it, Anthony. Try going up on your diff oils and let me know what you think. So what else? Have we covered this now, or is there still something else to say? Good starting setup. Let's see what we have. Let's see what our basic setup is now. Yeah, the diff size is similar to the others. Very, very close to the same size as Kyosho, except the center diff, which is big on Kyosho. Everyone always says, "Oh, my diffs are so small." It's fucking same size as Kyosho, dude. I'm gonna check my basic setup. I don't remember it. Stock a diff setup. What do you think about the trend in 10 scale diffs? Going up in the oil weight but removing 2 of the gears. I haven't heard about that. They are probably doing that because their 10 scale diffs are too small and they suck. What's my preferred method of filling my diffs? Watch one of the very first Facebook Lives where I built diffs. Okay, so apparently our current standard setup, kit setup, is 10,000 front, 6,000 center, 3,000 rear. And the theory behind that is that 10,000 in the front is going to make the car easy off power. You have a bit less steering off power. 10,000 is pretty thick. So it's neutral going into the corner of power. Then you get on the power and you have on power steering, but not too much, nothing crazy. 10,000 is good for that. So it's a good compromise. And 10,000 also is pretty much the thinnest that I run. Center, 6,000. 6,000 because a thin diff will generally be easier to drive. On a loose track, the thinner the center diff, the easier it is. The thinner the center diff, the less off-power steering you have. Two things which just make it easy to drive. Less drive, less off-power steering, so a thin diff is good. But we can't go too thin because there are drivers who run in hot weather, high grip, and in those conditions, if a diff is too thin, it actually makes the car inconsistent. So 6,000 is a good compromise. Rear diff, 3,000, because again, it's just an average setup, a compromise. It's not too thin, not too thick. Work in all conditions. You can run 3,000 on any track. So neutral going into a corner, you get on the throttle, also neutral. 3,000 should always work. If you want to gain an edge, that's when you start playing with the diff oils. So 10.6.3 is the standard setup now on the car. Okay. Any more questions? What diff fluid is best for track cutting? That we're going to cover tomorrow. I really feel like having a bit of a rant tomorrow. I want to talk about cutting tracks. I'll also talk about this idea I have, another idea. We'll leave that to tomorrow. Hey Liam, Astro setup for diffs. I've never actually raced on Astro because Astro is gay and stupid. Actually, I shouldn't say gay, that's homophobic, right? Astro is really, really silly. And I don't know what diffs to run on Astro. Just to confirm, thinner center diff oil will mean less off-pass steering. Yes, but it's not like it's super noticeable. It is, but it's not a huge deal. No, I don't want to run Astros, but someone asked about Astro diff setup, so tell him. So okay, just a conclusion. My feelings on diffs. Conclusion. JQ Racing official statement. This is all you need to see. If you are watching this, I should probably tell them just to fast forward it. No, it's not that serious of a conclusion. The thicker diffs you can run, the faster you can be, I feel. Yes, because the car will naturally be faster. You'll have more drive. These bastards who are really good at driving and have a lot of talent, doesn't matter what diffs they have. They'll just be good and fast anyway. But people like me, who need all the help they can get, then those thicker diffs really help. The hotter the weather, the higher the grip, the thicker diffs you want to run. In general, all three. Because the diffs will make the car more forward drive, stay more flat, be more consistent, and not be all over the place and hard to drive. The more loose the track, the colder it is, the more bumpy and difficult the track is, the thinner you want to go on the diffs. Up to a point. You almost want to start somewhere. Maybe in that case you start with thin diffs and you keep going thicker until it starts getting hard to drive. According to those things I explained before. You start going thicker on the front diff until you... Well, actually the front diff, as I said, not so much. You're not going to have huge issues there. You start going thicker on the center diff until you have issues, until it gets loose. You start going thicker on the rear diff until you have issues. So you max out the thickness you can have for any track condition. And that's about it. Diffs are easy, man. This is why diffs are easy. Basically, no matter what your diff setup, as long as it's not something completely ridiculous, like really ridiculous that you have to be an idiot to run. If it's like within this universe, then they don't really matter. And I say they don't really matter because some talented idiot will just drive around it. Serious. Like, if you give a really good driver a car where the shocks are just like way off, like the suspension just doesn't work at all, he just won't win. If you give a talented driver a car that has, let's say, like 553 instead of 1227 or vice versa, they can still win. Like, the diffs make a difference, yes, but is it such a big difference that it makes a car like undrivable or drivable? Within reason, no, not really. Like when we are talking about 5 to 20,000 in the front or center diff, any of those diff oils will be okay. On the rear, when we're talking about like 2 to 10,000, any of those will be okay. Like, a good driver can handle it and can drive the car. So yes, they make a difference, but yeah, it's not life and death. Is there a big difference between oil brands? Yes, there is. Just like in shock oils. In shock oils we can all tell. We build the shocks with the same oil and it's like, oh, what the hell? Like it's way too soft with this, and this other brand it's fine or whatever. Well, the same with diff oils. It's just harder to tell. So you should always stick to the same brand. So you don't want to be mixing brands too much. Unless, of course, you're mixing brands and you know the difference. Like I don't have 20,000, so I use something else. Yeah. But yeah, there is a difference. I haven't tried Kyosho. I assume you're running Kyosho oils. I haven't tried them, so I don't know. So I can't comment on those. Exit corner, lost the message. Exit corner, I want the car to go straight on power. Well, what's it doing now? That's the question. As I said, going straight on power. The front diff, not gonna be the reason for you not going straight on power. Center diff, it can be. If your center diff is too thick, then when you want to go straight, you hit a bump or you're just exiting the corner, the rear gets loose. You spin out. It's more so the moment you get on power. If you get on power and there's this like slight drift, you feel the car drifting like this, or oversteering, but it's slower, then it's the rear diff. Like I almost feel like sudden changes, like suddenly losing the rear, is the center diff. This like slight drift and slowly losing it is the rear diff. That might be one way you can tell if it's the center or the rear diff causing the problems. What's the thickest diff oil? Well, the thickest diff oil that I've run this year is 20,000. Because then I started feeling like there was some negative side effects. Like the car felt stiff going around the track. Like it just didn't feel as nimble anymore. I wasn't quite in control. I couldn't quite hit my lines. So yeah, so 20,000 was the thickest. But 10 to 15 was a good range for the rear diff oil. But if there's a lot of Americans here, most of your tracks probably you'll want to run thinner diff oils in the rear. Like the standard is 3, but try going thicker. Try 5, try 7, try 10. You know, see what you think. Okay. So I think we covered the diffs. I built my diffs. We talked about all the diffs separately. We talked about the diffs in general. We concluded that the thicker you go, the faster you are. High grip, thick oils. If the car is difficult, especially if it's bumpy or loose, you don't want to go thin, and then you want to go step by step thicker until you find or until you have negative consequences, and then that's where you stop. E-buggy, I agree. We covered this. Good job, everyone.